Afternoon, good afternoon. This oversight hearing is conducted by the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication. Notices were sent out, and the agenda for this afternoon is fairly simple. Why don't we have everybody come up? Christine, DOA, and UOG. Why don't you just come up? This shouldn't be too long.
Yeah, everybody. Yeah, right in the middle, Christine.
That's right.
Good afternoon. First, I want to thank the Department of Administration for providing much of the documentation as requested by the Committee on Appropriation and Adjudication relative to fiscal year 2017 cash releases to the Guam Department of Education, the University of Guam, and the Guam Community College, as well as its plans for cash releases to these educational agencies for this fiscal year 2018. I understand that DOA has only provided planned fiscal year 2018 cash releases for the general fund and has stated that special fund cash releases will be provided as the cash from those specific funds are collected and become available. I also want to thank our educational institutions for being present today. The goal of this oversight hearing is simply to bring everyone to the table so we can prioritize education funding for the community. Oftentimes, we as politicians claim that we prioritize education above all else, and this Guam legislature surely has done so, providing nearly 40% of the entire GovGuam budget towards education. But the problems we seem to be having is that cash, as it relates to the annual appropriation, is not fully making it to the education agencies in a timely manner as the legislature had prioritized. In fact, this body has provided as much budgetary support as it can. We have exempted all education agencies from BBMR allotment control, which means the BBMR cannot place reserves on the appropriations to education agencies. Recently, in this most recent fiscal year 2018 budget, we now have required reporting of cash remittances versus appropriations to be reported on a quarterly basis so the transparency of our education agencies' cash release issues can be self-reported to the public. The Guam legislature is able to appropriate the funds, and this body gets chastised for never appropriating enough. But even with the amounts appropriated, with all the budgetary safeguards and flexibility that this body provides, DOA is the agency tasked with providing the cash to back up these appropriations. This is why we call an oversight hearing with DOA and not BBMR. This is why we ask for cash release data from DOA. For the benefit of the public, based on the data provided by the Department of Administration, number one, the University of Guam's total appropriation for fiscal year 2017 was $39.9 million. According to DOA documentation, cash released to UOG attributable to fiscal year 2017 appropriation, it provided $25.5 million plus an offset of $2.1 million, totaling $27.8 million. There remains $12.1 million, or 30% of the FY17 appropriation that is yet to be provided in cash to UOG. For the Guam Community College, appropriation for fiscal year 2017 was $20.7 million. According to DOA's documentation for cash release to GCC, attributable to fiscal year 2017 appropriation, it provided $15.5 million. there still remains $5.2 million, or 25.3% of fiscal year 2017 appropriation that has yet to be provided in cash to GCC. The Guam Department of Education's appropriation for 2017, including amounts for school lunch, not including amounts for school lunch program and charter schools, was $221.6 million. According to DOA's documentation for cash released to GDOE attributable to fiscal year 2017 appropriations, it provided $218.1 million. There still remains $3.5 million, or 1.6%, in fiscal year 2017 appropriations that have not yet been provided in cash to GDOE. It appears that DOA continues to play cash catch-up with our education institutions because it fails to provide them with the cash it needs during the fiscal year in which funds were appropriated. With this reflected in DOA's data provided to the committee for fiscal year 2017, in which UOG received $8.9 million in cash during fiscal year 2017 related to fiscal year 2016 appropriations due to DOA not providing that cash during fiscal year 2016. GCC received $5.3 million in cash during FY17 related to FY16 appropriations due to DOA not providing that cash during fiscal year 2016. GDOE received $1.78 million in cash during FY17 related to FY 2016 and prior appropriations due to DOA not providing that cash during those prior fiscal years. This chronic cycle of not providing cash to our education institutions in a timely manner has led to the issues we now face today. To put it this way, the government seems to be essentially taking out a short-term loan against the appropriations to our education agencies and is continuously trying to pay them back during the subsequent fiscal years. I wanted to place this perspective on the class issues the government of Guam is facing when it comes to prioritizing the limited resources we have. When decisions are made by the administration to increase spending in other areas, we must reflect on how these decisions impact other areas of our government, such as cash remittances to GDOE, UOG, and GCC. Our education partners that we all say are our #1 priority, and how they are not receiving their cash in a timely manner. This oversight hearing is also intended on providing information on the plans for the cash releases for GDOE, UOG, and GCC for the fiscal year 2018, so that instead of our education agencies finding out in July, August, or September that they will not be receiving all their cash for the proper fiscal year, it can hear it up front if those are the plans that DOA has. I requested that UOG, GCC, and GDOE provide the committee with weekly or monthly cash drawdown schedules so that it has provided to DOA, and I want the public to understand the commitment that DOA has in fulfilling those schedules on a weekly, monthly, or quarterly basis. Let's begin this discussion with the first item on the agenda relative to what plans are to catch up with cash remittances to our education institutions for FY 2017 without compromising FY 2018 funding. I guess the first question is to the University of Guam. Does the university have any commitments, written or verbal, from DOA on providing cash for the remainder of the fiscal year 2017 appropriation balance?
Yes, we've had a couple of meetings, and we had one meeting last week, and DOA committed to making good on the, basically we're having a little bit of discussion about what is actually owed. The amount that you gave, I think includes debt service, which was not required. But in any event, our main concern is $9.7 million in operations funds. So we received a commitment last week that they will make good on it with 2017 tax settlements. So that is the basis upon which I've been informed by the Department of Administration on how they're going to make good on the 2017 balance.
Yes, President Underwood, I received that email yesterday, and then I received the hard copy today of your letter.
Right.
But I noted that it did not include anything in writing from DOA. Did you receive anything in writing from DOA? Was that
No,
a
I
verbal
have not.
commitment? Ms. Boleto, of this 9.7 that the university is concerned with, what plans do you have to make good on that, and how soon?
Well, one of the things I want to clarify before we get into that is the total amounts that you've included as owed include special funds that were short on collections. So one of the reasons why I continuously meet with the heads of the department agencies is to let them know certain funds like TFF or the Manpower Development, I forgot it's MDOL fund, that have been short in collections, we cannot possibly pay out to the appropriation amount because there was insufficient funds collected with which to pay. So the amounts that you listed, our amounts are quite different. And again, we've worked with each of them to be able to come to an agreement. With respect to 2017, one of the things that we did this fiscal year was from the beginning of the fiscal year reset, and we are using 2018 funds to pay the 2018 appropriations. We have up until December with which to collect on amounts for 2017 that will be recognized as revenue, and that is what we're committing to them to make whole on any outstanding balances.
And so, till December, the collections that you make will make good on that 9.7 that is still outstanding to the university?
We're hoping to do that. We're working with the Department of Revenue and Taxation. They've given us some estimates that we believe are going to be able to cover the amounts owed, and so that's the plan.
And for GCC, do you have a similar commitment with them or an arrangement with them?
That's correct. And with GCC, theirs again includes the Manpower Development Fund, which we will not be paying out because it was short of collections.
I understand the manpower development and the special funds.
Right.
But just how much do you recognize as due and owing to GCC for 2017?
$2.4 million.
And is that the number that you have, Madam President?
That is a number that we worked out with DOA, so understanding that the total appropriation from the general fund from the year has a set aside of 10%, which we anticipated at the beginning of the fiscal year that we would not receive. So the 2.4 is correct. So the 5.2 million that you identified as the balance includes the 2.7 million that was identified at the beginning of the fiscal year as a cash set aside, in the event the cash doesn't come in that we would not receive.
And you're not going to receive that at all then? There's not going to be, if I was to look in the CRER about releases to the agencies, how many agencies still have 10% outstanding?
Remember that in the beginning of the fiscal year, BBMR put a 15% reserve on all line agencies, and so pretty much all the agencies have been cut by that amount unless they were able to demonstrate, and I don't know specifically, but I would assume some of the law enforcement. I know we're having some issues with overtime at DOC and some other expenses that they need to cover, but most line agencies took the 15% since the beginning of the fiscal year.
But, and I know I've spoken to all three of these agency heads, and to their credit, they've been willing to be good team players and are willing to, in spite of the fact that we passed legislation that says they're not supposed to be subject to BBMR allocation, understand and are willing to accept the 15% or work with the 15% allocation, though it's not supposed to be done. They have graciously told me that they're willing to suffer that if they are treated equally like everybody else. And so that's why I'm asking, if I was to go through the CRER, and just so you know, I did read it last week, would it show that all the other agencies are ending the year with a 10% still in their not received, or are these three agencies the only three that are going to suffer this?
No, if you review the CRER, you'll see that most of the agencies have leftover balances because of the restrictions put on their spending. Not we're all equal, as I mentioned. In order for them to get any more released out of their budget from the 15% reserve, they had to justify that to BBMR. I don't know what the process is, but it would be based on, their approval and that release for specific purposes. But from the beginning of the fiscal year, the 15% reserve was put into place for all departments.
And if you were to go down to the CRER right now, which ones would you point out to me that have still 10% that have not been received? Because I remember distinctly, because of my discussion with Chairman Nelson, her public safety agencies, and theirs is like down is not 15%.
No, if they justified, like I mentioned, and with the law enforcement agencies, there's been various issues with which they had to justify to BBMR to release any additional funds. So like I said, it's not all even. You'll see some that have more than 10%. You have some that's less than 10%, but everyone was put into that same pot and from the beginning of the fiscal year.
And again, I ask, can you point out which ones besides these two on either side of you have 10% of their appropriation withheld?
Well, I haven't done the actual percentage calculation, but if you look at individual and collective rights of 1.1 million against an 8 million appropriation, I think that would be more than like 10%. There's a balance in every single one of them, but I can go through and calculate and submit that to the committee later.
Yeah, if you would, please, because
Okay.
I mean, really, to their credit, all three of them have come in and told me they are willing to be good team players if they are treated equally as everybody else. And they will endure through the year the 15% set aside in spite of the statutory prohibition. But at the end of the year, if everybody's getting releases that get them to 5%, or, some agencies that are less, they just want to be treated equally. And I know that President Okada has been very, very good about that. And in spite of my trying to needle both of them to please, they're just saying no. They understand and are willing to be a team player and are willing to, but they just want to be treated like everybody else. And if there are agencies, and I could go through it, you can send me your list, and I'll send you my list of who didn't, and ask where the equity is, especially when they're saying they're not going to get 2.7 because of the fact that 10% is being withheld.
Well, one of the issues that we've had that I've been working with all three on to kind of minimize this vicious cycle, as I keep calling it, in which for decades these education institutions have been owed money at the end of every fiscal year. Unlike the line departments that once the fiscal year ends, they don't have the ability to carry over, and so they're basically cut off and they're reset every year. With these folks, every beginning of the fiscal year, I know with UOG, we owe them over 8 million, with GCC over 5 million, and then we've owed DOE various amounts throughout the fiscal year. So I think that in my meetings with them, we're getting closer to, once we start paying out in the beginning of the fiscal year, then by the end of that fiscal year, we would have paid out all of their appropriation, minus the special funds, which is always contingent upon the collections.
If we start discussing like GDOE, the superintendent was in here his budget hearing and reported what his weekly allotment was. And I asked him what DI math was he using to multiply that weekly allotment to get to 52, to get to his appropriation. Because their weekly allotment, in even this fiscal year, as I understand it, though it stated it should be 4.3, they were getting only 3.8.
Because again, you're including special funds in that release. Territorial Education Fund doesn't have collections until February, so we cannot include that in the weekly release. But if you ask the superintendent, as of 9/30, their full general fund appropriation was paid out to them. Now we're just working on special funds. So obviously the system that we put into place worked. We were able to pay everything out to them, where I believe by the end of this fiscal year, we would have made GCC whole, and by the end of the fiscal year, they would have been paid out and everything. Unfortunately, the UOG one is a little bit larger than the two, and so, you know, in our discussions, we're hoping it'll take another 2 fiscal years before we minimize that gap. But that is definitely the goal, is to start paying in the beginning of the fiscal year on those funds, general fund particularly, and then by the end of the fiscal year, have them paid in full.
And for all 3 agencies, is their weekly allotment, all right, take out special funds, is their weekly allotment that's on the books right now? I mean, and I understand that there are some good months and some bad months and the ebb and flow, whatever. But the commitment is to give X number of dollars per week or per month. And if I was to use my abacus and multiply it times 52 or multiply it times 12, it would come up to what this legislature appropriated. And
for
not
general
any
fund
amount,
operations,
yeah, for
yes.
general fund operations.
Yes.
That's the in writing what their weekly, monthly, or quarterly allotment release is going to be, right?
For UOG and GCC, we have a little bit of a different situation with GDOE because general fund is advancing payments out of the general fund for TEFF expenditures, particularly the JFK lease of 7.2 that was due October 15, and then we have the Ukudu, or no, I think it might be JFK maintenance. Is that October? We have Ukudu and JFK maintenance due about October, and then we have the Teedson lease of 10.1 due in December, and so that's why we've had to minimize the general fund releases to them, because general fund is covering the TEFF expenditures. It was the same system that we used last year. Then come January, we bumped up their weekly releases. By February, we were able to catch up, and then by September 30, we've paid everything out. So we're on the same system with them.
And I want to thank Superintendent Fernandez. Today you did provide this afternoon a report that shows that you've gotten your full monthly allotment. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, I do want to thank Director Boleto for working with us. I mean, as you know, we've had several years of issues that we've been trying to recover from. So at the update you got, we updated it as of yesterday. Does show that we got 99% of our appropriations, and the remainder is in the special fund category. So that left about, I think as of the end of today, we're showing about 2.1 million that was not released. So we thank DOA for their assistance with that.
And that's all that I wanted this oversight hearing to come away with. I wanted to have on the record a commitment and an acceptance by the 3 agencies that their weekly, monthly, quarterly release would be using a mathematical formula that would come out to their full year's appropriation, as opposed to minus 10% or minus 15%. That's all I wanted today, and I just wanted the assurance from each one that the agreement that you have, or your allotment release that you provided to DOA and has been signed off, will at the end of the fiscal year mean that you've received the full appropriation made by this body that we keep getting criticized by everybody as being insufficient, but they're now going to suffer at 10%. I don't know how much they're suffering, and I know he had to suffer me in the beginning of the summer, telling him, go get your 5.1 million that was owed from 16 that still hadn't been paid up yet. So I'm not even bringing up 16, I'm just saying.
That's what we had to do, like I said, to be able to catch up and make them whole. That the whole goal is to be using the current year's revenues to pay off the current year appropriations, because as we continue to pay with this year's revenues a prior year obligation, of course, it doesn't take a lot of mathematics to know at the end of that fiscal year, you're going to be short, because unless there's additional funds that come in over the appropriated amount, you're using that money to pay on a prior year obligation. So, you know, we've asked, DOE was the first one, like you mentioned, to work with us, had to take a little bit of a hit, but they've been made whole this fiscal year. Our next goal is to get GCC whole this fiscal year, and then work with Yoji. You're just larger, but we'll get to you. We'll finish it up. Yeah.
Yeah, we're all team players, but some of us are better team players than others.
And that's what I've been trying. All I want is just that commitment on the record that the public understands that these three agencies have really been, I think, your biggest supporters. I mean, I can't get them to do anything. Really, seriously. Well, to get them to publicly speak out that they're short. I mean, I had to call an oversight hearing and FOIA release of what they were owed to get the amount that was owed to them. But, yeah, and and so.
We've been on record every single year as to what is owed. We're not shying away from that responsibility, but we had to do something. We had to develop a plan to try to get past this and get back on track, and that's really where we're headed.
And I appreciate that. And that's all I wanted from this hearing, was that the four of you would sit down individually and talk, and you'd come away with an agreement that would say by next September the 30th, that the 30 million or the 21 million or the 221 million that we appropriated would be released to them.
Well, and just also to clarify, if you look at the actual cash, even though there was a certain portion that was attributed to the last fiscal year, you'll see that for the most part, that actual full appropriation of cash had been paid out. It's just that a good portion of that, primarily October, November, December, as we paid that on the prior fiscal year, they had nothing to credit to the current fiscal year, which is what put us again in this situation. So I think we're doing better this fiscal year, and like I said, we'll get GCC whole by the end of this fiscal year, and then we'll work on UOG.
And I appreciated that, because when I FOIA'd all of the checks, we went through every single one of the checks and looked at the memo at the bottom. And yes, we were able to show that for the University of Guam, 8.9 million was attributed for 16, and the 27.8 was for 17. Which came up to the 36,
right?
Which is the amount that we were hoping that they would get. But
right.
The thing that I didn't want was, without pointing out which one was threatening on doing it every fiscal year, one of the three was suggesting maybe I should submit an appropriation 10% more than what I really need, so that if they take the 10% of the top, I will actually get my operating expenses. And I'm like, you're going to completely throw me off. Just don't do that. I mean, it's hard enough to try to make it balance. And so we were able to talk them off that ledge. I mean, I wasn't going to accept an appropriation request that was 10% more in the hopes of, well, if we shoot for the sky, we'll we'll get to
Yeah, I just
less,
want to say
and-
we have a good working relationship. We meet regularly. If I see any of the special funds trending downward, I try to give them advance notice so that they can prepare for that. And so I'd like to think and hope that the communication has improved so that, at the end of the fiscal year, there really was no surprises.
And you do have an excellent working relationship with them, let me tell you, because I keep saying, I'm the one that's pulling what little hair I have left out, trying to respond to people in public saying, why is DOE shorted, or why is UOG, threatening to do this or to do that, and I'm like, you have this money that we appropriated, go for it. And they're like, we've agreed, and all I want to know is that the four of you have agreed that for FY18, the allotment schedule that you've all signed, and I hope in blood, is going to be good by the end of the year, and that I'm not going to...
My blood's been drained.
that we don't have to have another one of these. I mean, and it was good. I mean, I got a lot of paper, and I had to add up lots of stuff to look and see how much was 16 and how much was 17, but just trying to make them whole. That's all, because I think it's imperative, and especially superintendent at the end. I mean, he's the one that comes in at 346. But if we can just at least get them the 2/3 that they asked for, they would be doing well, and that's really all that I wanted to get on the record today, and I was very thankful that that you've all provided us with, and as of yesterday, they were updating, both of them. That's why I was asking President Okada, do you have good news for me? Because the other two were made whole yesterday, or at least promised, and so...
We met first before the oversight.
Okay, good. Then I just wanted to get that on the record, and I will, if anybody has questions, they may ask, or if any one of you want to make any additional statements. Otherwise, that was really just all I wanted today with this oversight. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just do have one question. Director Barletto, you mentioned that the 10% that is usually withheld at the beginning of the fiscal year, some of the appropriation, I guess, can be distributed on a request from the agency. And so I wanted to know what is like the selection criteria for how you would, qualify it as, okay, we're going to release some of the withheld funds.
That actually is a BBMR function, so when they get the full appropriation amount from the budget law, they implement a 15% reserve. Those requests to release the reserve go directly to them, so yeah, DOA doesn't, we just know when it's released, and the agency comes to us and requests for payments against, whatever it is that they had released.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
But I thought that we had asked, or at least put into the Budget Act for this last year and this year, that BBMR was not to have authority to withhold any amounts for them.
For the
That's-
departments?
For these, no, for these,
No,
just
they
these three?
don't, they don't do anything for these guys. It's BBMR, it's loaded based on whatever I guess their request is. We just work individually with them based on what actual cash comes in. Because you can have a budget, but if the cash doesn't match up to what that budget request or the release request is for that month, then we're not able to do so. So it doesn't affect these three. Those are for the line agencies.
But that I think might have been the question that was being posed was, how can she justify the release of her 2.7 or 10% that's still being withheld? What does she need to show?
We just work that out among ourselves. So we try to go, we meet, we discuss it, we see what we can do so that, again, we can work towards getting the full appropriation amount within the appropriate fiscal year.
And then just to further question, now that BBMR doesn't have the, I guess because of the law that we passed, doesn't have the authorization to withhold, the education agencies, they are going to get paid out at least through the general fund continually, right?
I don't believe they've ever had control. I'm not sure. It's been, at least since I've been with the government, my understanding is BBMR didn't control their allotments. So it's just basically loaded. And again, we work with them on the DOA side based on the availability of cash.
Yeah, I guess that's why it was confusing is what I'm saying, because if they're getting shorted some money, then I'm just wondering why and how.
So for example, with the territorial education facilities.
I understand the special
Yeah, so it's
concept.
the
You
same
don't have to
concept,
explain.
yeah. General
But,
fund
yeah.
is no different. It depends on collections.
Yes.
What cash is available, we try to distribute. But if there's cash collections that's short, even in the general fund, then we cannot pay out based on the allotment schedule.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just hoping that they don't get shorted again and we have to have another oversight before and then,
Well,
yeah.
that's the goal.
Okay.
Yes.
Very good, thank you.
I have only, this is great news to hear, especially being the oversight on education. But what I'm concerned about, Ms. Beletu, and with the superintendent, is that DOE is in a different position versus GC and UOG. And the only reason why I say that is because they have to deal with the charter schools. And whenever there's a shortfall in DOE, I think DOE is the only one that takes the full blunt of that, and it's not spread across. I think the superintendent needs to work it with you so that when there's going to be a shortfall on DOE's budget, because they're the one that's where you're drawing the money for charter school, correct?
Charter schools is separated out based on the estimate or the amount of students and the amount that's been appropriated per student. So that's kind of separated out in the beginning, and we draw from that fund. DOE's operations, their textbooks, all of their special funds, we're drawing from a different appropriation. So that's one of the things that we're dealing with this fiscal year, is to see at when we end where the charter schools finish off in, because I believe this is the first fiscal year that they'll have some additional funds available, and then that would revert back to DOE. But it's based on the amount per student that you guys identify in the law.
I understand that, but I'm just saying is that, when DOE is going to be, when we know already that you're not getting the fund collected, you're not being able to give them their full allotment for the month, and it includes also money for charter school, there's got to be some equity. When DOE is short, I'm not saying be short charter school, but they got to be prepared to understand that when DOE don't have a lot of money, you can't draw from the same pot when it's got to be balanced. I mean, I'm
so
just
we
saying,
want to short the reimbursement to them? It's like 200,000 every 2 weeks.
No, I'm just saying that I know that DOE, on many occasions, when they get the invoice, when you get the invoice from charter school, and they have to verify, and it goes back to you, if you don't have enough money for that month, I can't see how you can draw it, and then DOE drops it back into the hole until they climb back out. I think I spoke to you about that, Mr. Fernandez, so you work that out with DOA, and then let me know how that's going to work out.
I can speak to that. I believe our board raised this in the meeting. I know you might have been present there in discussing the charter school. So there are two issues that were raised about charters. Number one, if there is cash constraints that are affecting the department's ability to collect, there should be a requisite constraint on how much is released to the charters. That was one of the board's main points. So I think that was the issue with regard to, just managing the cash and sharing it across all schools. The second issue was with regard to, I think Director Barreto referenced it correctly, what happens at the end of the fiscal year if funds remain in the charter schools budget that are unexpended. And so that's the other piece that the board wanted to bring up. So, we are continuing to discuss that and as well as bring it up to your attention.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and your testimony. And I want to give you my appreciation for working this out prior to this hearing. And I appreciate all your efforts. You're right. You've been making this message very clear over the past hearings that I've been involved with, how you intend to handle the cash flows. So I just wanted to clarify a couple statements, make absolutely clear that I understand what you said. You said something about you're going to use collections until December to pay for the 2017 balance for UOG in particular. And which collections are these? Are these not FY18 collections? Is there some special collections that DRT is working on that were over and above what
normally
we've appropriated for 2018?
Yeah, normally if the collections are attributed to the prior year's receivables, then that's when the revenue is recognized in that prior fiscal year. Collections for 2018, for example, the BPT coming in that's paid in October, any fees, license charges or whatnot, that's 18 funds. And so 18 funds are being used to pay out on 18 appropriations.
What type of receivables are you talking about that were not paid?
You would have to talk to DRT. They're very careful, if you will, about the information that they hold. So, I mean, I personally cannot even get any information from them as far as like what that represents or whatnot, but they just report to us what their expectation is. In my time working with DRT, they've been able to deliver whenever they give an estimate, and so that's what we're kind of counting on.
Is it possible that there are more receivables than you need in order to pay UOG for FY 2017? Is there extra receivables for 2017?
You'd have to ask DRT. I'm sorry, I don't have that information.
All right. And then, so it sounds like it's a different process this year that last year you said there was a 10% set aside from each of these three agencies or institutions, but this year that set aside is not going to take place.
That's what we're working with.
Okay.
So the weekly release that we've worked out intends to make them full as of September 30. Again, it's the plan. It all depends on collections from month to month. But if we stick to this plan, by 9/30, they should be fully paid on those appropriations.
All right. And you would not stick to this plan because of what? I mean, you're going to say shortfalls in revenue?
Obviously. So November is historically a very low collection month for the government. It's actually the worst out of the 12-month period. So we would just have to see what comes in and make sure that we cover all those obligations.
Okay, so you also said that DOE was, you are advancing from the general fund the TEFF payments that aren't going to come in until February?
Correct.
And is that going to, so in February, you will make their general fund appropriations whole? But
yes,
their
it reimburses general
TEF
fund.
might also be short at the end of the fiscal year. Is that correct?
It depends on the total collections. So there's February and April in which people pay their property taxes. And so come February, we try to reimburse the general fund what has been advanced for payments under TEFF. But it just all depends. So one of the things that we've worked out with DOE is identifying when that TEF funds comes in and it reimburses the general fund to use that to focus on, like, for example, their textbooks, which they plan to place the order in February so that they meet the March deadline. So we're working out all those special considerations for what they need to accomplish within their own department.
All right, but the balance in TEFF that was owed to DOE for 2017 is going to be a wash. You're not going to pay that, right?
Cannot.
Okay, cannot.
Yeah, the
what
fund
was
was
the
short.
shortfall of the
1.1 million.
Okay. And all right, and then my last question is, the other agencies that you've seen the BBMR allotment schedule, are there any significant differences from last year as to how much would be set aside from or withheld from the different agencies?
Not my understanding. Yeah, I think they're going to put that 15% reserve if they've not already done so. I know they've done it with DOA, so I'm assuming they've done it with everyone.
All right, thank you. Okay. Mr. Fernandez.
Just, Senator, with just one clarification. I mean, yes, we did sit down with Director Barleto to work out the schedule, and I think I appreciate the fact that we do it at the beginning of the fiscal year so we can know what to expect and know how we can, and then we can manage from there. But one thing that is different from the prior years, and it's due to the Speaker and the Committee on Appropriations, that we are less exposed to TEF, you know, in FY18 and hopefully going forward. So that issue with the TEF shortfall hopefully will not be something that will affect us this year. So that'll be hopefully a notable difference.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know that you asked this question generally, but I just wanted to make sure that we follow up for the record. So Director Barleto, based on what you submitted, you would be providing $4.1 million per week to the Guam Department of Education from the general fund. Is that correct?
For the first 3 months, it's 3.8 weekly because, as I mentioned, we're paying out on additional funds, and so
from the general fund.
Correct. So as an example, we did a 3.8 weekly for a total of 15.2 from general fund, and then an additional 2.1 that general fund covered, so the total release was 17.3 million. If you break that down to weekly, it's about 4.3 million weekly.
4.3 weekly.
Yeah, so it just depends on what other needs that they have that we have to cover. We try to balance it out.
Okay, thank you. And Superintendent Fernandez, will that suffice?
So, I mean, it'll be a management task to ensure that we make it through the first quarter without significant impact. I think the issue is just basically trying to, the way that we work the schedule out is that by January we should start chewing up the weekly allotments so that we're back on schedule. So, with the upfront, the payout that they made, that reduces the first quarter's weekly allotments. And so we're working internally to make sure that we manage through payroll and vendor payments. But the expectation is that by January and February, the way the schedule works out, we should be back on schedule and we'll be able to manage more successfully thereafter.
Okay, thank you.
So, but I think the issue is that we understand what the situation will be, so now we can be more proactive about addressing how we'll be able to handle our obligations.
Okay, thank you. And Director Barleto, for UOG, that's $647,000 per week from the general fund? 674. That's what you're committing?
So it's 674 weekly.
Okay.
Yes.
And President Underwood, will that suffice?
Yes, it will for student financial aid and for general operations.
Thank you. For the Guam Community College, Director Barleto, $379,000 per week?
Correct.
And President Okada, will that suffice? Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, Ms. Barleto, and to all of the education leadership that's before us. I just want to take this opportunity to be able to commend you in terms of working closely together with regards to these issues. Obviously, in many instances, we look at oversight hearings to be able to try to delve into specifics and find out why certain situations are not panning out based on either law or based on anticipation of operations. In this particular case, you've come before us, you provided the Speaker and the Chairman with the appropriate information, and you've really provided not only the leadership here, of education, but you provided every single student out there and every stakeholder out there in terms of exactly where the financial situation is as it applies to general fund. Special fund is a different case, and obviously it's always subject to collections on a quarterly basis or on an annual basis, but when it comes to general funds, and if in fact the general fund revenues collected is on target based on the revenue projection of the budget, then obviously there's always that anticipation that these agencies would get their allotment without any set aside. So I really appreciate the information and the perspective that's shared here. This is really the way the government should work in terms of being able to communicate well with each other and understand exactly where we are with finances to this very date. So thank you very much, and thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
If not, I want to thank all four of you for coming down, but more especially, I really do think you have a great team with you.
Yes.
And I appreciate the fact that you stated that there's no need for me to FOIA. So
you're not the only one who's been FOIA'd, I can tell you that.
I honestly believe I'm the queen. I can prove it.
So if you would, between the four of you, provide me with a copy of the agreements that you've all come to understand and sign off on, right, so that I'm apprised of it and we can keep track of it. Okay. So right, without a FOIA, I can expect that that would be provided. And with that, I want to thank all of you, and this was a good trick or treat.
Trick or treat. All right.